Imagine boarding a flight, only to land in a completely different time. Or worse, being taken by something from the sky, only to be returned, changed forever. In today's stories, we'll dive into terrifying encounters with UFOs, mysterious abductions, and mind-bending journeys through time. From eerie lights in the night sky to strange figures that defy explanation, each tale will leave you questioning what really happens in the shadows. Stay with us until the end and share in the comments, where are you watching from, and what time is it where you are? Vanished in the mountains, a soldier's tale. Sergeant Marcos Silva had always been captivated by legends, especially the one that spoke of a hidden treasure deep within the mountains of Minas Gerais. The story had been passed down through generations, a tale of a lost cave filled with gold and jewels, hidden away by ancient indigenous tribes to protect it from colonizers. Many had tried to find this treasure, but all had returned empty-handed or worse, never to be seen again. Marcos was no stranger to danger. As a dedicated soldier, he had faced many challenges in his career. But this was different. The thrill of discovery was too tempting to ignore. During his downtime between missions, he immersed himself in research, studying old maps and listening to the stories of locals who claimed to have seen the cave. As he gathered more information, the excitement grew within him. He spoke to fellow soldiers about his plans, sharing the legend and the details he had uncovered. Some laughed it off as a silly myth, while others admired his adventurous spirit. But Marcos was undeterred. He was determined to uncover the treasure and prove the legend was real. One day, after weeks of preparation, Marcos set out alone for the mountains. He packed only the essentials: water, food, a flashlight, and a map he believed would lead him to the treasure. The journey was arduous, with steep inclines and rugged terrain, but the thrill of the hunt fueled his determination. As he trekked deeper into the wilderness, the landscape began to change. The air grew cooler, and the trees loomed taller and thicker. Shadows danced in the fading light as the sun began to set. Marcos felt a mix of excitement and apprehension. He was close, he could feel it. After hours of hiking, he finally spotted an entrance to a cave, partially obscured by vines and foliage. His heart raced at the sight. This could be it, the legendary cave that had consumed his thoughts for so long. He approached cautiously, the entrance yawning before him like a dark mouth waiting to swallow him whole. Marcos took a deep breath, steeling himself for what lay ahead. As he stepped inside, the air turned cool and damp, and the light from his flashlight flickered against the wet stone walls. The cave was larger than he had anticipated, stretching deeper into the earth, with jagged rocks jutting out like teeth. He pressed on, the excitement coursing through him. As he ventured deeper, he felt an unsettling stillness settle around him, as if the cave itself was holding its breath. He pushed the feeling aside, focusing on the treasure that awaited him. After all, legends were meant to be uncovered. But as he moved forward, strange noises echoed in the darkness, whispers that seemed to swirl around him, and the sound of dripping water that created an eerie rhythm. It felt as if the cave were alive, watching him, waiting. Still, he pressed on, driven by the hope of discovery. Little did he know, he was not alone. As Marcos ventured deeper into the cave, the flickering beam of his flashlight illuminated the damp walls, revealing more intricate patterns carved into the stone. The symbols resembled those he had seen in the drawings of local folklore, hinting at an ancient civilization that once thrived in these mountains. Excitement bubbled within him. This was no ordinary cave, and he was on the cusp of uncovering something significant. However, with each step, the air grew colder, heavier. The whispers intensified, a chorus of unintelligible voices that seemed to echo from the depths. It was unsettling, yet Marcos dismissed it as the effects of his imagination, fueled by the isolation and the thrill of the hunt. He focused on the treasure, envisioning the gold and jewels that had captivated his dreams for so long. Suddenly, the ground beneath him shifted slightly. He paused, feeling a twinge of unease. Was the cave shifting? Or was it just his nerves? He took a deep breath, steadying himself, and continued forward. The path twisted and turned, and the further he went, the darker it became. The light from his flashlight barely penetrated the blackness ahead. Then, out of the corner of his eye, he saw it, a flicker of movement. He whipped his head around, shining the flashlight in the direction of the disturbance, but there was nothing. Just the stillness of the cave and the rhythmic sound of dripping water. He cursed under his breath, reminding himself to stay focused. This was just a treasure hunt, there was no place for fear. As he rounded a corner, he found a small chamber. Stalactites hung from the ceiling like jagged teeth, and in the center lay a stone pedestal. His heart raced as he approached it, the hope of discovery igniting within him once more. But as he neared the pedestal, the atmosphere shifted. The whispers grew louder, more frantic, and he felt a chill run down his spine. Marcos reached the pedestal and gasped. It was empty. No treasure, no artifacts, just a cold, stone surface. Frustration welled up within him. Had he risked everything for nothing? He turned to leave, but as he did, he caught sight of something in the shadows behind him. The figure emerged again, tall and menacing, shrouded in darkness. Its features remained obscured, but the presence was undeniable. Marcos's pulse quickened as he took a step back, instinctively raising his flashlight. The beam illuminated the figure momentarily, and he felt a wave of terror wash over him. It was not human, its long limbs moved with an unnatural grace. "Who are you?" Marcos shouted, his voice echoing in the chamber. The figure remained silent, but the whispers escalated into a deafening roar, filling his mind with chaos. He could feel the weight of their gaze, the oppressive energy pressing in on him. In a panic, he turned to flee, darting back through the winding passages of the cave. The darkness felt alive, swallowing the light from his flashlight as he raced to escape. The whispers morphed into a cacophony, swirling around him, disorienting him further. The path twisted unexpectedly, and he stumbled, falling to the ground. The flashlight flickered and died, plunging him into darkness. Marcos scrambled to his feet, fear gripping him. He had to get out, had to escape whatever this was. As he stumbled forward, his hands brushing against the cool stone walls, he felt a shift in the air, a presence closing in around him. The whispers returned, now urgent and commanding, as if urging him to stop, to listen. But there was no way he could stay. He pushed through the fear, driven by a primal instinct to survive. Finally, he burst into the main tunnel, the faint light of the entrance in sight. Hope surged through him, but just as quickly as it appeared, it faded. The figure stood at the cave's mouth, blocking his escape, a shadow against the light. Panic gripped him as he realized he was trapped. Marcos stood frozen in place, staring at the shadowy figure blocking the entrance to the cave. His heart raced, pounding in his chest like a war drum. The light from outside flickered, taunting him with the promise of safety just beyond the darkness. But the figure loomed larger than life, its presence suffocating. He took a hesitant step backward, but the figure moved with an unnatural speed, closing the distance between them in an instant. Marcos felt a chill run down his spine as he caught a glimpse of its features, sharp, angular, with an expression that seemed to shift in and out of focus. The whispers intensified, swirling around him like a storm, drowning out his thoughts. "Leave this place," a voice echoed in his mind, not spoken but felt. It resonated deep within him, a command that sent a jolt of fear through his body. He instinctively knew that he was facing something beyond his understanding, something ancient and powerful. Marcos struggled to find his voice. "What do you want?" he shouted, the words sounding weak even to his own ears. The figure paused, tilting its head as if contemplating his question. The air grew thick with tension, and for a moment, the whispers quieted to a faint hum. "Your fate is intertwined with this treasure," the voice echoed again, clearer this time. "You seek what was never meant for you. You must turn back." The words hung in the air, heavy with foreboding. Marcos felt a mix of anger and fear. He had come too far to back down now. He had risked everything for this treasure, for the legends that fueled his dreams. He took a step forward, determination replacing his fear. "I'm not afraid of you," he declared, but his voice trembled as he spoke. The figure's expression shifted, a hint of amusement, or was it disdain, flashed across its face. "You should be," it replied, the tone chilling him to the core. You have awakened forces that should remain undisturbed." With that, the figure lunged at him, and Marcos barely had time to react. He dodged to the side, sprinting toward the entrance. The shadows seemed to reach for him as he ran, the whispers rising into a frenzied crescendo, urging him to stop, to submit. But he pushed through, adrenaline coursing through his veins. As he burst through the entrance, the sunlight flooded over him, momentarily blinding him. He stumbled into the open air, gasping for breath as he turned to look back at the cave. The figure stood at the threshold, watching him with an intensity that made his skin crawl. The moment of clarity came as he realized that this was not just about treasure. This was a battle for his very soul, a confrontation with an ancient power that sought to keep its secrets buried. He had been warned by the locals, by the whispers of the cave itself, but he had ignored them, driven by his ambition. Marcos knew he had to get away, to leave this place before it consumed him. He took off down the mountain, his legs moving faster than they ever had before. The weight of the cave, the figure, and the whispers bore down on him, but he was determined to escape. As he reached the base of the mountain, he glanced back one last time. The cave loomed ominously, a dark maw waiting to swallow him whole. He felt a mix of relief and dread as he turned away, knowing that the treasure would remain hidden, but the memories of what he had encountered would haunt him forever. Marcos reached the base of the mountain, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The adrenaline coursing through him dulled the fear, but the images of the figure and the whispers haunted him relentlessly. He stumbled forward, desperately wanting to put as much distance as possible between himself and the cave. As he approached his unit's camp, he spotted a few of his fellow soldiers gathered around a makeshift table, sharing stories and laughing. The normalcy of the scene felt surreal after his harrowing experience. How could they be so carefree when something so sinister lurked in the shadows? He felt a knot tightening in his stomach. "Sergeant, you all right?" one of his comrades called out, noticing his disheveled appearance. Marcos hesitated, the weight of his experience pressing down on him. Should he tell them what happened? Would they believe him, or would they dismiss it as another tall tale? The last thing he wanted was to be the subject of ridicule. "I just went up to check out the ruins," he finally said, trying to sound casual. "Saw some strange things, but it's nothing to worry about." The lie felt heavy on his tongue, but he didn't want to draw any attention to the darkness that had almost consumed him. That night, unable to sleep, he sat alone outside his tent, staring up at the stars. They twinkled in the clear night sky, a stark contrast to the darkness that still lingered in his mind. He tried to shake off the unease, but it clung to him like a shadow. His thoughts drifted back to the cave and the figure. Why had he been drawn there? Was it simply greed, or was there something deeper at play? He felt as though he had stepped into a story that had begun long before he arrived, one that intertwined with the very fabric of the land. Days passed, but the feeling of dread didn't fade. The whispers echoed in his mind, and he could almost feel the eyes of the figure watching him, waiting for him to return. He knew he should report his experience, but something stopped him. What if the authorities decided to investigate? What if they found nothing and ridiculed him for his fears? Then, one evening, news spread through the camp like wildfire. Another soldier had gone missing during a routine patrol near the same mountains. The camp erupted in whispers, each soldier speculating about what could have happened. Panic set in as the story spread, but for Marcos, it was a haunting reminder of what he had faced. He had heard the legends, stories of disappearances tied to the cave. Now, they were becoming a reality. The whispers grew louder in his mind, and he could no longer ignore them. He needed to confront the truth. Marcos gathered a small group of soldiers he trusted, those who had expressed interest in his experience. He knew they had to return to the cave and uncover what lay within. They couldn't allow the fear to take hold of them, and they certainly couldn't let another soldier fall victim to the darkness. As they prepared to set off, a sense of resolve filled him. They would face whatever was hidden in the shadows, together. The journey back to the cave felt like walking into the mouth of a predator, but this time, Marcos was determined to find answers. With the sun setting behind them, they hiked toward the mountains, the darkness creeping in as they approached the cave. The air turned heavy, thick with anticipation and dread. As they neared the entrance, the whispers began again, echoing from the depths. This time, Marcos wouldn't turn back. They were about to confront the unknown, a battle against the darkness that had haunted him since that fateful day. The gas station that shouldn't exist. It was late afternoon when Luca and his family decided to make a quick stop during their road trip. They had been driving for hours, winding through the quiet countryside roads, far from any major city. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows over the empty fields, they saw it, an old, run-down gas station standing by itself on the side of the road. There was something off about the place, something that made Luca's skin prickle as they pulled in. The station looked frozen in time, like it had been abandoned decades ago but somehow remained in operation. The faded sign above the pumps flickered weakly, barely readable. As they stepped out of the car, a heavy silence hung in the air, the kind that made every small sound feel louder, more intrusive. His wife, Sofia, glanced around uneasily while their two kids, Matteo and Anna, stayed close by, unusually quiet. Luca walked toward the entrance of the small store attached to the station, the glass door creaking on its hinges as he pushed it open. Inside, the air was thick, stagnant. Shelves were half-stocked with old, dusty items, as if no one had shopped there in years. A lone cashier, an old man with piercing eyes, stood behind the counter, his gaze following every move Luca made. There was no greeting, no smile, just those eyes, watching, unblinking. As Luca paid for the gas, a feeling of dread settled deep in his chest. Something wasn't right here, but he couldn't put his finger on it. The air felt too heavy, too still. Outside, the wind began to pick up, rattling the windows, and the light in the station flickered once, twice, before going out for a brief moment. The old man didn't move, didn't react. When Luca returned to the car, he noticed the pump was older than he first thought, almost ancient. It groaned as the gas flowed, the sound unsettling. Sofia whispered to him as they waited, her voice low and shaky, "Do you feel it too? Something's not right here." Luca nodded, trying to shake the feeling, but it clung to him like a shadow. As they pulled away, Luca glanced back in the rearview mirror, but the gas station was gone. Just like that. The building, the pumps, the strange old man, nothing was there but an empty stretch of road. His heart pounded in his chest as he blinked, looking again, but it was the same. Gone. He gripped the steering wheel tighter, his knuckles white. What just happened? Sofia leaned forward, her eyes wide, but she didn't need to say anything. They all felt it. There was no turning back now. Something had shifted, something darker, and Luca knew this wasn't over. As the night deepened, the road ahead seemed to stretch into an abyss, growing darker with each passing mile. Luca's knuckles whitened as he gripped the steering wheel, his breath shallow. The trees on either side appeared to close in, their branches twisting into eerie shapes that looked almost human in the faint glow of the headlights. Sofia sat beside him, her face pale, her eyes locked on the forest outside the window. Something felt wrong, terribly wrong. The GPS on the dashboard blinked out, the screen glitching before going completely black. Luca tapped it, frustration creeping into his voice as he muttered under his breath. There was no road on the map anymore. Sofia pulled out her phone, holding it up to check for a signal, but the screen showed nothing. No service, no connection. They were alone, surrounded by darkness. Ahead, an old wooden sign emerged from the shadows, its letters barely legible under the worn paint. Luca squinted to make it out, El Bosque de los Perdidos. The Forest of the Lost. Sofia's voice trembled as she read the name aloud, her breath hitching in her throat. Luca glanced at her, their eyes meeting in shared unease. They needed to turn back. This place, whatever it was, felt wrong. He slowed the car, scanning for a place to turn around, when something flashed across the road, a blur of white in the corner of his eye. Luca yanked the steering wheel to the left, and the car swerved violently. The tires screeched against the asphalt, the sound piercing the otherwise silent night. The car came to an abrupt stop just inches from the dense line of trees. His heart pounded in his chest as he gasped for air. Mateo and Anna stirred in the back seat, their sleepy faces now filled with confusion and fear. "What happened?" Mateo asked, his voice small in the heavy silence. Luca unbuckled his seatbelt, still catching his breath. "Stay in the car," he muttered as he stepped out into the cold night air, his eyes scanning the road for whatever had crossed in front of them. The forest seemed to grow darker as Luca walked a few feet from the car. The wind whistled through the branches, but there was no sign of movement. Whatever it was, it had vanished. A chill crept up his spine as he heard a faint sound in the distance, like a child laughing softly. It grew louder, distorted, echoing through the trees. Luca froze, his eyes darting around, but there was nothing. Only the shadows, stretching out, watching him. He turned back to the car, but his breath caught in his throat. The car was gone. The road, too, had disappeared, leaving Luca standing alone in the middle of an empty, unfamiliar landscape. Panic surged through him as he spun around, searching for any sign of his family, of the vehicle. There was nothing. Just the wind and the darkness. Meanwhile, back in the car, Sophia looked over at Luca's empty seat. A cold wave of fear washed over her. She stepped out, her heart racing, calling his name into the night. But all she heard was silence. And then, that same eerie laughter echoed from the trees. Sophia stood frozen in place, her breath coming in shallow, rapid bursts as the eerie laughter seemed to fade into the wind. The towering trees around her swayed gently, their branches creaking as if whispering secrets to each other. She glanced back at the car, her pulse quickening. The children were inside, their small faces pressed against the windows, watching her every move with wide, terrified eyes. She knew she had to stay calm, had to keep it together for them. But Luca was gone. She stepped away from the car, her feet crunching softly on the gravel beneath her. The road stretched out ahead, but it felt different now. It was as if the very earth beneath them had shifted, changed, and nothing was as it seemed. Her phone lay broken on the ground, the screen dark and unresponsive. She knelt to pick it up, her fingers trembling as she cradled it in her palm. Useless. Just like everything else here. Sophia took a deep breath and looked into the dense forest ahead. The darkness between the trees seemed to pulse, alive with something she couldn't quite explain. Every instinct screamed at her to get back in the car, to turn around and leave this place behind, but how could she? Luca was still out there, somewhere. She could feel it. He had to be. Suddenly, a movement caught her eye, a flicker of white deep in the trees, barely visible through the thick underbrush. Her heart leaped in her chest as she took a hesitant step forward. The laughter had stopped, but something else lingered in the air, something far more unsettling. It was as though the forest itself was watching her, waiting. Mateo's voice broke through the silence, weak and trembling. "Mom, where's Dad?" Sophia turned to face the car, forcing a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Stay in the car, sweetheart. I'll find him, I promise." But even as she spoke, she wasn't sure she believed her own words. Her stomach churned with dread. She ventured deeper into the trees, each step heavy with the weight of the unknown. The air felt thick, almost suffocating, and the silence was deafening. No birds, no insects, just the sound of her own footsteps echoing in the stillness. Branches reached out like fingers, brushing against her arms and shoulders, and she had to resist the urge to swat them away. Then, she saw it, just ahead, half hidden behind the thick trunk of an ancient tree. A figure. Luca. Relief surged through her, and she called out his name, but he didn't move. Didn't turn. He stood there, still, as if rooted to the spot. Sophia quickened her pace, her heart pounding with hope and fear all at once. But as she drew closer, her steps faltered. Something was wrong. Luca's posture was rigid, unnatural. His head hung low, and his hands were limp at his sides. A cold wave of fear washed over her as she stopped a few feet away, her voice shaking. "Luca?" He didn't respond. The air around them seemed to thicken, pressing in from all sides. And then, slowly, he began to turn. Sophia's breath caught in her throat as his face came into view. But it wasn't Luca. The eyes that stared back at her were hollow, empty, and his skin was pale as ash. A low growl rumbled from deep within the figure's throat, its lips curling into a twisted, grotesque smile. Sophia stumbled backward, her mind racing, but she couldn't move fast enough. The trees around her seemed to close in, the darkness swallowing her whole. And behind her, the laughter returned. Sophia's breath came in short, ragged gasps as she fled through the trees. Every step felt heavier, as if the ground beneath her was pulling her back, trying to keep her trapped in this nightmare. Behind her, the distorted figure that once resembled Luca stood still for a moment, then moved again, its empty eyes following her through the forest. The laughter echoed once more, growing louder, wrapping around her like an invisible fog. Branches clawed at her skin as she stumbled through the dark forest. Her legs ached, but she couldn't stop. The trees seemed to close in, their twisted forms looming larger with every passing second. The children. Matteo and Anna were waiting in the car. She had to reach them. She had to protect them. The car appeared ahead, sitting still on the road like a beacon in the night. Sophia rushed forward, her feet slipping on the uneven ground, her heart pounding in her chest. When she finally reached the vehicle, her hands shook as she grabbed the door handle and yanked it open. Matteo and Anna looked up at her with wide, terrified eyes, their small bodies huddled together in the back seat. Sophia threw herself into the driver's seat, her hands fumbling with the keys. She turned the ignition, but the engine sputtered and died. Panic clawed at her throat as she tried again. Nothing. Her heart raced faster, the silence around them growing thicker, heavier. Sophia glanced out of the window, searching for any sign of the figure that had chased her. There it was. Standing at the edge of the tree line, watching. Its hollow gaze locked onto the car, and its smile stretched impossibly wide. The air inside the vehicle grew cold, frost creeping along the edges of the windows. Matteo whimpered softly, clutching Anna's hand as they both stared at their mother, waiting for her to do something. Sophia tried the ignition one more time. This time, the engine roared to life, its sound cutting through the oppressive silence. She slammed her foot down on the gas pedal, the tires screeching as the car lurched forward. The figure vanished into the darkness behind them as they sped down the road. But something wasn't right. The road ahead was too familiar. Sophia's eyes narrowed as she recognized the same stretch of road they had just driven through. And then, up ahead, the gas station appeared once again, sitting exactly where it had been hours before. The old pumps, the flickering sign, the crumbling structure, it was all there, as if they had never left. Her stomach twisted as she slowed the car. The station loomed before them, unchanged, eerily still. She glanced at the GPS, but the screen remained blank, just like before. Matteo leaned forward, his voice barely a whisper. "Mom, is that the same place?" Sophia's hands tightened on the steering wheel, her eyes locked on the gas station as an overwhelming sense of dread settled over them. They were back where they started. Stranger on the road, a witch's trap. It was late in the evening when Jacob found himself driving along an empty country road, the sky fading from deep orange to dark purple as the sun dipped behind the hills. The quiet hum of the car was the only sound, and the endless stretch of road ahead gave him an odd sense of isolation. He wasn't far from a small town he had passed earlier, but something about the silence around him felt heavier as the evening grew darker. As Jacob rounded a bend, his headlights illuminated a figure walking along the side of the road. It was a woman, her arm raised in a hitchhiker's gesture. There was something calm and almost out of place about her appearance. She wore a simple dress, her hair flowing loosely down her back, and she seemed completely at ease despite the loneliness of the road. Without thinking much of it, Jacob slowed the car and pulled over beside her. The woman approached the car with steady steps, and Jacob offered her a ride. She nodded silently, her expression neutral, and climbed into the passenger seat. For a few moments, neither of them spoke. The soft hum of the engine filled the silence, and Jacob glanced at her briefly, sensing something strange. She seemed normal enough, but there was an odd tension in the air between them. he eventually broke the silence, asking where she was headed. The woman turned to look at him, her gaze lingering just a little too long. Her eyes seemed to hold something unnerving, a depth that unsettled Jacob in ways he couldn't explain. "Nowhere in particular," she finally replied, her voice soft but with an underlying weight that made Jacob's hands tighten on the wheel. "Just passing through." Jacob gave a quick nod, trying to brush off the growing discomfort. As they drove, the woman began to speak again, this time about strange topics, rituals, forgotten ceremonies, and dark practices that Jacob had never heard of. Her voice was calm, almost casual, but the details of what she described made his skin crawl. The way she spoke of rituals sounded less like stories and more like experiences, as if these things were all too real for her. "Have you ever heard of the veil between worlds?" she asked suddenly, her voice cutting through the quiet. Jacob glanced at her, a chill running down his spine. He shook his head slowly, trying to focus on the road, but the woman continued, her tone becoming darker. "The veil," she explained, "separates this world from others. It's thin tonight. Thinner than you'd think." Jacob could feel the weight of her words pressing down on him, and he stole a glance at her. Her face seemed paler now, almost ghostly, and the temperature in the car had dropped noticeably. Before he could speak, before he could even process what was happening, she vanished. In the blink of an eye, the seat beside him was empty. Jacob's heart raced, and he slammed on the brakes, the tires screeching against the asphalt. The car came to a halt in the middle of the road, but there was no trace of the woman. She was simply gone, leaving only the cold, eerie silence behind. Jacob's mind raced as he sat frozen in the driver's seat, his knuckles white from gripping the steering wheel. The night was eerily still around him, the sound of the wind through the trees the only movement. He kept glancing at the empty seat beside him, unable to process what had just happened. One moment, the woman had been there, speaking of strange rituals and dark things. The next, she was gone. Not a trace. It didn't make any sense. He took a deep breath, trying to shake off the cold dread that had settled over him. Maybe it had been his imagination, a trick of the light, or fatigue. He hadn't slept well in days, and his mind was playing tricks on him. But the silence that followed her disappearance, the way the air had grown heavy and cold, lingered like a bad omen. Still, he had to keep moving. Shaking his head, Jacob started the car again, the engine rumbling back to life. He pressed on down the road, hoping to leave whatever strange encounter had happened behind him. As the minutes passed, the road ahead began to twist and turn, leading him deeper into the countryside. His thoughts wandered, replaying the woman's words in his head. The veil between worlds. Thin tonight. The eerie calm in her voice haunted him. An hour later, as the sky grew darker, he reached the edge of a small village. It was a quiet place, the kind of town that felt forgotten by time, with narrow streets and old brick buildings. Jacob slowed the car, relieved to see signs of civilization again. He thought about stopping for the night, finding a place to clear his head. Maybe a warm meal and some rest would help him shake off the unease that had gripped him since that strange encounter. But as he drove past the narrow alley, something caught his eye. A figure. A woman. She was standing near the entrance of the alleyway, facing the street, her back straight and still. Jacob's breath caught in his throat. It was her. The same woman he had picked up just hours ago, the one who had vanished from his car without explanation. But something was different now. She was wearing different clothes, a long, dark cloak that hung loosely around her frame, almost blending into the shadows behind her. Her hair was tied back, and her face, though partly obscured by the dim light, was unmistakable. Jacob's heart pounded as he pulled the car to the side of the road. He had to know. He had to find out who she was and what was happening. His curiosity overpowered his fear as he stepped out of the car, walking cautiously toward her. She turned slowly as he approached, her expression calm, almost serene, as if she had been expecting him. "You again," he said, his voice barely a whisper, more to himself than to her. The woman's eyes met his, and she gave a small smile. "Evening," she said softly. Thank you for the ride earlier. Would you care to come to my home for a cup of tea? It's just up the hill." Jacob hesitated, the cold grip of fear tightening in his chest. He knew something was wrong, deeply wrong. But the woman's voice was inviting, and against his better judgment, he found himself nodding, agreeing to follow her. Jacob followed the woman up a narrow, winding path that led through the village and toward the hills beyond. The cobblestone streets under his feet seemed to echo in the stillness of the night, the only sound breaking the heavy silence. The village felt deserted, with no signs of life from the houses they passed. Curtains were drawn tight, and no lights flickered in any of the windows. It was as if the entire town was holding its breath. As they walked, Jacob couldn't shake the growing sense of dread that settled deeper in his chest with each step. The woman moved gracefully, her dark cloak swirling around her like the very shadows that clung to the edges of the road. Every now and then, she would glance back at him with that same calm expression, but there was something unsettling about her eyes. They seemed too calm, too knowing, as if she was leading him somewhere he didn't want to go. Ahead, the path narrowed even further, twisting up the side of a hill that overlooked the village. Perched at the top, surrounded by towering, gnarled trees, was an old house. The building was large, its dark silhouette looming against the sky like a forgotten relic from another time. Its windows were black and lifeless, and the very air around it felt thick, oppressive, as if the house itself was watching him. Jacob's instincts screamed at him to turn back, to leave this place and never return, but his feet kept moving forward, drawn by some unseen force. He didn't understand why, but it was as if the woman's presence had cast a spell over him, dulling his senses and clouding his judgment. Every step felt heavier, the air colder the closer they got. When they finally reached the front of the house, the woman paused at the gate, turning to face him. Her smile was faint but unsettling, like the calm before a storm. "Please, come inside." "I insist," she said softly, gesturing toward the door. Jacob hesitated, glancing at the house, then back at her. His mind screamed for him to turn around and run, but he found himself nodding, following her through the gate. The inside of the house was just as unnerving as the outside. The air was thick with the scent of herbs, and strange symbols adorned the walls, symbols Jacob didn't recognize but felt were ancient, powerful. The dimly lit room was filled with odd trinkets and books, their titles obscured by dust and time. A large cauldron sat in the corner, bubbling quietly over a low flame. The woman moved gracefully to a table where 2 cups of tea had already been set out, as if she had been expecting him all along. She gestured for him to sit, her smile never wavering. "You've been kind," she said, pouring the tea with slow, deliberate movements. "Not many would have helped me on that road. It's only right I offer you something in return." Jacob sat, his heart pounding in his chest, his mind screaming at him to leave, to run. But something held him there, something he couldn't explain. As he reached for the cup, he noticed the reflection in the surface of the tea. For a brief moment, it wasn't his face he saw, it was hers, twisted into something monstrous, her eyes burning with a darkness he had never known. Jacob's hand trembled as he pulled it back from the cup, his pulse racing as the unsettling image of the woman's twisted reflection faded from the tea's surface. The room around him seemed to close in, the air growing thicker, more suffocating. Every instinct in his body screamed at him to leave, but it felt as though something invisible was holding him in place, binding him to this spot. The woman sat across from him, her eyes fixed on him with an unnatural calm. She took a sip of her tea, her movements slow and deliberate, as if savoring each moment of his discomfort. "You're nervous," she observed, her voice low and soothing. "There's no need to be. You're safe here, with me." Jacob swallowed hard, his throat dry. He tried to speak, to ask her what was happening, but the words stuck in his throat. The symbols on the walls seemed to shift and dance in the flickering candlelight, their meaning lost to him but their presence heavy, oppressive. The shadows in the corners of the room grew darker, deeper, as if something lurked within them, waiting for the right moment to strike. The woman's smile widened ever so slightly, and she set her cup down gently on the table. "You've been so kind," she said softly, her voice taking on a more sinister edge. "But kindness comes with a price. I'm afraid you'll have to pay yours now." Jacob's blood ran cold. He pushed back his chair, the wooden legs scraping loudly against the floor, but as he stood, the room seemed to shift around him. The door he had entered through was no longer there. In its place stood a solid wall, the windows now sealed by thick, ancient curtains that blocked out all light from the outside. The house had trapped him. He turned to the woman, but she was no longer the calm, serene figure he had picked up on the road. Her face had changed, twisted into something monstrous, her eyes burning with an unnatural glow. The air around her shimmered, like the very fabric of reality was bending to her will. "You should have never picked me up," she said, her voice now a guttural whisper. "The veil between worlds is thin tonight, and you've crossed into mine." Jacob stumbled backward, his heart pounding in his chest, but there was nowhere to run. The shadows around the room seemed to pulse, growing thicker, darker, until they began to take shape, twisted, ghostly figures that moved toward him, their hollow eyes staring into his soul. The woman rose from her chair, her movements slow and deliberate, as if she had all the time in the world. "This isn't your world anymore," she said, her voice echoing through the room. "You belong to the shadows now." Jacob's mind raced, panic surging through him as the figures closed in, their icy presence sending shivers down his spine. He tried to scream, to fight, but his voice was swallowed by the darkness. The last thing he saw before the shadows enveloped him completely was the woman's cold, twisted smile. And then, there was nothing. He landed. But in a different time. Maximilian was exhausted. After months of intense work on a major software project, he had finally earned a short break. Living in Germany, far from his family in the United States, had taken its toll on him. So when his vacation days were approved, he booked a flight to Boston to visit his parents, eager for some much-needed rest. It had been too long since he'd seen them, and the thought of being home filled him with a sense of comfort. But from the moment he boarded the flight, something felt wrong. The plane was unusually empty. There were only a handful of passengers scattered throughout the cabin, and the air felt thick, almost oppressive. The lighting inside was dimmer than usual, casting long shadows across the seats. Maximilian glanced around, feeling a slight chill creep up his spine. The flight attendants, dressed in outdated uniforms, moved mechanically, their faces expressionless. No one spoke. The silence in the cabin was unsettling, broken only by the soft hum of the engines. As the plane taxied down the runway, Maximilian tried to shake off the unease settling in his chest. He pulled out his laptop, thinking that maybe some work would distract him, but as soon as the plane lifted off, the screen flickered and went black. He frowned and glanced at his phone, no signal. He assumed it was just standard interference from the flight, but something about it felt different. The air pressure seemed wrong, and the usual announcements from the captain never came. Hours passed, and Maximilian dozed off, his sleep restless and filled with strange, vivid dreams. In one, he was floating through a thick fog, unable to see anything around him. Voices whispered in the distance, unintelligible but insistent. He woke with a start, heart pounding, and glanced out the window. Below, there was no sign of the familiar sprawling landscape of the U.S., just vast stretches of dark clouds, obscuring everything below. When the plane finally began its descent, Maximilian felt a strange sense of relief. The lights of what appeared to be a city below came into view, but something wasn't right. The buildings looked different, older, almost antique. As the plane touched down, the runway itself seemed worn, as if it had seen better days. He tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was an older part of the airport, but the unease in his chest only grew stronger. Stepping off the plane, the airport felt deserted. The signs were all in English, but the technology, the layout, it felt decades out of date. The air inside was still, thick with a sense of something long forgotten. There were no bustling crowds, no rush of travelers. Just silence. Maximilian approached the exit, his heart racing, unsure of where he had landed. But the final shock came when he stepped outside and saw the cars, old models from the 1960s, lined up along the curb as if it were a normal day. Confused and disoriented, he flagged down a taxi, the driver greeting him in an oddly formal tone. Maximilian gave his parents' address, still trying to process the bizarre situation. As the car wound through the quiet streets, the buildings around him confirmed what he feared. He wasn't in the present anymore. The taxi moved slowly through the streets, and Maximilian's unease deepened with every turn. Outside the window, the world seemed frozen in a different time. The cars, the houses, even the clothes people wore appeared to belong to another era. It was as though he had slipped into the past, but he couldn't explain how or why. His fingers tightened on the seat as he tried to steady himself, but the sense of something being terribly wrong grew with each passing second. The driver remained silent as they turned onto the familiar street where Maximilian's parents lived. The road, though recognizable, felt like a shadow of what it should have been. The houses were old, worn down by time, their paint faded, their windows dim. The air outside was thick with stillness, the kind that makes every small sound seem louder, sharper. The taxi came to a stop in front of the house that Maximilian knew so well, or at least, thought he knew. It stood there, as it always had, but everything around it had changed. The houses on either side were much older, their structures sagging under the weight of years. Trees lined the street, taller and wilder than he remembered, casting long, twisted shadows in the late afternoon light. Maximilian stepped out of the taxi, his heart pounding in his chest. He walked slowly toward the house, his footsteps heavy on the cracked pavement. The door looked worn, its once bright color faded to a dull shade. He paused, uncertainty washing over him. This wasn't the home he remembered, yet it was. Something was off, and he couldn't shake the feeling that stepping inside would take him deeper into this strange, altered reality. He raised his hand to knock, but before he could, the door creaked open. Standing there, in the doorway, were two children. They stared up at him with wide eyes, filled with curiosity. Maximilian froze, his breath catching in his throat. The boy and girl in front of him weren't just any children, they were his parents. Or rather, they were his parents as children, just as they had been decades ago. He couldn't believe what he was seeing. His mother, just a young girl, stood there, her hair tied in loose pigtails, her face innocent and unfamiliar with the future she would one day live. Next to her, his father, a small boy with the same eyes Maximilian had seen in family photos, watched him in silence. Maximilian's mind raced, struggling to process the impossible reality before him. He took a step back, his legs trembling, as if the ground beneath him might give way. How could this be? How had he traveled not just across an ocean, but across time itself? He turned, fleeing back to the street, his heart pounding in his ears. But when he looked for the taxi, it was gone. The world around him seemed to close in, leaving him stranded in a time he didn't belong. Maximilian stood frozen on the quiet street, his mind racing with questions. The world around him felt unreal, like a dream he couldn't wake from. His parents, no, the children who would one day become his parents, had been standing right in front of him, as real as the air he was breathing. But how could that be? How could time have twisted in such a way? He took a deep breath, trying to steady himself, but the weight of confusion pressed harder with each passing moment. The street, now eerily empty, seemed to stretch endlessly in both directions, as if there was no escape. The air was still, heavy with an unnatural silence. Even the birds in the trees had stopped singing, leaving him alone with his thoughts. Without the taxi to return him to the airport, Maximilian felt trapped. His only choice was to walk, hoping to find some sign of where, or rather when, he was. The streetlights flickered weakly as he started down the road, his footsteps echoing faintly against the pavement. The houses, with their old-fashioned designs and chipped paint, loomed on either side, like ghosts of a forgotten era. As he walked, he tried to piece together the events that had led him here. The strange flight, the quiet passengers, the oppressive atmosphere in the plane. Something had happened in the air, something that had pulled him out of his time and deposited him in this distorted version of the past. But what? He had no answers, only the overwhelming sense that he was out of place in this world. Hours passed, or at least it felt that way. The sky had darkened, the sun now barely a sliver on the horizon, casting a dim, orange glow over the quiet streets. Maximilian's legs ached, but he kept moving, his mind still buzzing with confusion and fear. How had he ended up here? Was there a way back? As he walked, he noticed something strange in the distance, a flicker of movement in the corner of his vision. He stopped, his heart racing, and turned to look. A figure stood at the end of the street, watching him. It was too far away to make out any details, but the presence of someone else, anyone, made his pulse quicken with both hope and fear. He began to approach cautiously, each step deliberate. The figure remained still, waiting, as if it had been expecting him. As he drew closer, a sense of dread washed over him. The figure's outline was blurred, indistinct, like it didn't fully belong to this world. Maximilian stopped in his tracks, his breath catching in his throat. The figure made no move, no sound, but its presence was undeniable, like a shadow that shouldn't be there. Suddenly, the figure dissolved into the air, vanishing without a trace. Maximilian stood there, stunned, as the street around him remained quiet and still. He was alone again, lost in a world that wasn't his own, with no way to return. 10 days had passed since Maximilian had first stepped off the plane into the strange, altered world. Or at least, he thought it had been 10 days. Time itself seemed distorted here, slipping away without any clear sense of when one moment ended and the next began. The past had swallowed him whole, and no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't find his way back. The small town remained eerily frozen in its past state. Maximilian had wandered through the streets, through the woods surrounding the town, searching for any sign of the present. But the town never changed, and he never found another soul. The figure he had seen on the street that day haunted him, a reminder that something much larger than he could comprehend was at play. He hadn't seen it again since, but the weight of its presence lingered. Exhausted, confused, and feeling on the edge of madness, Maximilian made his way back to the place where it had all started, the airport. The runways were empty, and the terminal itself looked abandoned, as if it had been left to time's slow decay. Weeds had begun to take over the tarmac, and the silence was suffocating. He wandered the empty terminal, passing by old, faded posters and forgotten luggage. There was no sign of the world he had left behind, no clue as to how he might escape this nightmare. And yet, deep inside, he still held onto a sliver of hope that somehow, he could find his way back. It was on the 10th night that everything changed. Maximilian had found a seat in the old terminal, his eyes heavy with exhaustion. As he sat there, staring out the large windows at the empty runway, something strange happened. A light flickered in the distance. At first, he thought it was his mind playing tricks on him. But as the light grew brighter, he realized it wasn't an illusion. A plane was descending, its headlights cutting through the darkness. Heart pounding, Maximilian rushed outside, running toward the landing strip. The plane touched down smoothly, rolling to a stop at the edge of the tarmac. He stopped a few feet away, his breath coming in shallow gasps, his mind reeling. It was the same plane. The very same one he had boarded what felt like a lifetime ago. The door opened, and without hesitation, Maximilian climbed aboard. The cabin was just as he had left it, eerily quiet, with only a few passengers scattered throughout. He collapsed into his seat, his heart racing, as the plane began to taxi back onto the runway. When the plane landed again, everything was normal. The terminal was bustling with travelers, the sunlight streaming through the windows. It was as if no time had passed at all. 10 days lost in a time he couldn't understand, yet here he was, returned to the present. His family greeted him with relief, though they had feared the worst. No one could explain what had happened. And neither could he. For girls, one UFO, a terrifying truth. It was the early days of autumn in 1960 when the quiet town of Derry, Maine, was thrown into a state of panic. The leaves had just begun to turn, their vibrant hues of orange and red decorating the streets, but the peaceful season was shattered by an event that would haunt the town for years to come. For families, living miles apart, each reported the same inexplicable incident. On the same evening, their daughters had disappeared without a trace. The girls, Alice, Clara, Evelyn, and Susan, were all teenagers, and each had been in different parts of town when they vanished. Alice had been helping her father close the family's general store, Clara was on her way home from a friend's house, Evelyn was at the local diner with her younger brother, and Susan had been walking the family dog. All four disappeared within minutes of each other, in broad daylight, without any witnesses. The town was small, and news spread quickly. Families gathered in shock, desperately searching for answers. The police, baffled, launched a search that lasted through the night, scouring the woods, rivers, and streets for any sign of the missing girls. But there was nothing, no footprints, no clues, no indication of where they might have gone. As the hours dragged on, fear gripped the community. Some whispered that the girls had been taken by someone lurking in the shadows, while others spoke in hushed tones about something darker, something not of this world. It was a theory that most dismissed, but a few couldn't help but wonder. After all, there had been strange sightings in the sky in recent weeks, bright lights that moved too fast, disappearing into the night without explanation. Just when it seemed hope was lost, the unthinkable happened. Early the next morning, the girls returned. They were found in the same places they had disappeared from, confused and frightened, but unharmed. None of them could explain what had happened or where they had been. All they could recall was a blinding light that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. And then, just as suddenly, they were back. The police, desperate for answers, questioned the girls relentlessly, but their stories remained vague. Alice remembered standing in a strange room, its walls glowing with an unnatural light, but everything else was a blur. Clara spoke of shadows moving just out of sight, while Evelyn recalled a sensation of floating, weightless, as if gravity had ceased to exist. Susan, the quietest of the group, said little at all, her eyes distant, as if still trapped in whatever nightmare they had experienced. None of the girls could explain how they had returned or what had happened during the hours they were gone. The only detail they all shared was the memory of a strange, triangular room, bathed in blinding light. And the fear, an overwhelming, suffocating terror that lingered long after they had returned home. As the days passed, the town of Derry struggled to move on, but the mystery of that autumn day remained, casting a long shadow over the community. The girls had been returned, but they were no longer the same. Something had changed, and though they couldn't say what it was, they all felt it, deep inside. In the days that followed their return, the girls found themselves haunted by the memories of what had happened. Though their families and friends tried to reassure them that they were safe, something inside each of them knew that was far from the truth. The vague flashes of light, the disorienting sense of time slipping away, none of it made sense, and yet the feelings lingered, as real as the ground beneath their feet. Alice, the most outspoken of the group, had trouble sleeping. Every night, as soon as she closed her eyes, the same image would appear, a triangular room, its walls glowing with an eerie, unnatural light. The shape was so vivid, so sharp in her mind, that she began to sketch it obsessively, filling page after page of her notebook with the same image. No matter how hard she tried to focus on anything else, the memory of that room consumed her thoughts. Clara, normally the most level-headed, found herself growing paranoid. She began avoiding certain places in town, particularly open fields and large stretches of sky. The feeling of being watched had never left her since the incident, and every time she looked up, she swore she could see something moving in the distance, far beyond the clouds. Her parents dismissed her fears, insisting it was just nerves, but deep down, Clara knew something was still out there, something waiting. Evelyn, the most sensitive of the group, was plagued by strange dreams. Every night, she found herself floating in an endless void, surrounded by bright lights that pulsed rhythmically, like the heartbeat of a giant creature. In her dreams, she could never move, only drift helplessly as the lights grew closer and closer, until they became blinding. She would wake in a cold sweat, her heart pounding, the sensation of weightlessness still clinging to her skin. Susan, always quiet and reserved, had withdrawn even further into herself. She barely spoke, her eyes constantly darting to the shadows, as if expecting something to emerge from them at any moment. Her once lively curiosity had been replaced by a deep, unshakable fear. When her parents asked her what was wrong, she simply shook her head, unable to put the terror she felt into words. As the weeks passed, the town grew restless. Rumors swirled, each more outlandish than the last. Some said the girls had been part of a government experiment gone wrong, others whispered about alien visitors who had come to study them. No one had any answers, but the fear was palpable. Strange lights continued to appear in the night sky, flickering in and out of existence, just as they had before the girls disappeared. The girls tried to return to their normal lives, attending school and participating in community events, but they were no longer the same. The memories of that day, the triangular room, the lights, the unexplainable fear, followed them everywhere, casting a dark shadow over their every move. They didn't talk about it much, but they didn't need to. Each of them knew the others were feeling the same thing. And though they had been returned, they couldn't shake the feeling that whatever had taken them wasn't finished. As the weeks turned into months, the strange events surrounding the four girls only seemed to intensify. The town of Derry remained on edge, with whispers of the unexplainable filling every corner. But while the rest of the community could only speculate, for Alice, Clara, Evelyn, and Susan, the experience was becoming harder to ignore. The memories of that day had not faded. Instead, they had become sharper, more intrusive, creeping into every aspect of their lives. Alice's sketches had become more detailed, more frantic. She no longer filled her notebooks with just the triangular room, but with other shapes and symbols she didn't recognize. Her fingers ached from hours of drawing, but she couldn't stop. It was as if her hand moved on its own, capturing images from a part of her mind she had no control over. At night, she could hear a faint hum, a sound that no one else seemed to notice, but that kept her awake for hours, the pulsing rhythm matching the lights she remembered from that day. Clara's paranoia had deepened. Every shadow seemed to contain a threat, and every gust of wind felt like something was brushing against her skin. She had taken to carrying a flashlight with her, even during the day, shining it into dark corners, hoping to find something that would explain the feeling of being watched. But nothing ever appeared. The open sky terrified her, and she avoided looking up, afraid of what she might see. Evelyn's dreams had taken a darker turn. The lights she had once drifted toward now felt like they were consuming her, pulling her closer to something she couldn't see. She began waking up in the middle of the night, convinced that she was no longer alone in her room. The sensation of floating had become a constant, and even during the day, she would feel her feet leave the ground for brief moments, as though reality itself was beginning to lose its grip on her. Susan remained the most withdrawn. She had stopped going to school altogether, unable to focus on anything but the shadows that seemed to follow her everywhere. Her parents were worried, but Susan wouldn't talk, not even to her closest friends. Her eyes, once bright and full of curiosity, were now dull, as if something had been taken from her. At night, she would sit by her window, staring out at the sky, waiting for something she couldn't name, but that she knew would come for her eventually. The town tried to move on, but strange lights continued to appear in the sky above Derry. Each night, they would flicker, just for a moment, before disappearing again. No one could explain them, and though many tried to ignore it, the town's sense of unease grew. The girls' families had become reclusive, avoiding questions and refusing interviews. Something had changed in them as well. The girls knew the truth, though they rarely spoke of it. Whatever had taken them that day, whatever had brought them back, was still out there. Watching. Waiting. As the months dragged on, the strange occurrences in Derry showed no signs of stopping. The town had grown accustomed to the lights in the sky, though no one spoke about them openly. People kept to themselves, avoiding conversations that might lead back to the events of that autumn day. But for Alice, Clara, Evelyn, and Susan, the nightmare had only just begun. Alice's sketches had taken on a life of their own. Her room was covered in drawings of symbols, shapes, and figures she didn't understand, but they filled her with dread. She tried to stop, tried to push the images out of her mind, but the more she resisted, the stronger the urge became. It was as if something was pushing her to remember, forcing her to relive the fear she had felt that day. She began hearing voices, faint whispers in the night that called her name, urging her to follow them. Clara's fear of the open sky had reached a breaking point. She no longer left her house, terrified of the vastness above. The feeling of being watched had grown unbearable, and every time she looked out her window, she swore she saw shapes in the distance, shadows that moved against the clouds, just out of sight. She kept her curtains closed at all times, but even then, the sense of something watching her never went away. Evelyn's dreams had become more vivid, more terrifying. The lights that once seemed so distant were now closing in on her, surrounding her every time she closed her eyes. The sensation of floating had become constant, and she began to lose track of time, unable to tell if she was awake or still trapped in the dream. She started writing down the details of her dreams, hoping to make sense of them, but the more she wrote, the less they made sense. Susan had become a shell of her former self. She rarely spoke, her eyes distant, as if she were no longer fully present in the world. Her parents were at a loss, unsure of how to help her. At night, she would sit by her window, staring up at the sky, waiting for something. She knew, deep down, that whatever had taken her before would come back. It was only a matter of time. Then, one night, everything changed. The lights in the sky appeared again, but this time, they didn't disappear. They grew brighter, closer, until the entire town was bathed in an eerie glow. The air vibrated with a low hum, and the sky seemed to pulse with energy. Alice, Clara, Evelyn, and Susan all felt it, deep inside. They knew that the moment they had been dreading had finally arrived. The lights hovered over the town for what felt like an eternity, casting long shadows across the streets. And then, just as suddenly as they had appeared, they were gone. But the girls knew the truth. Whatever had taken them once, whatever had brought them back, was still out there, and it wasn't finished with them. They had been returned, but they would never truly be free. And now, we're left with one haunting question: what really happened to those who vanished, and what awaits those who were returned? Each of these stories leaves a chilling sense of the unknown, the kind that lingers long after the lights go out. But which story terrified you the most? Was it the plane that disappeared into another time, or the girls taken by something beyond the stars? Let us know in the comments, and if you have a terrifying experience of your own, we'd love to hear it. Before you go, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe. It helps the channel grow and brings you more eerie stories like these. And don't stop here, there are plenty more spine-tingling videos waiting for you on the channel. Thank you for watching, and remember, some mysteries are better left unsolved.